So here's an overview of what we're going to go through today. I'm going to give a brief welcome and introduction to the group. And we are right at the end of the first working group, and we're transitioning to a second working group to continue the work. So Adam Viles-Moore, my fellow co-chair, is going to give a presentation about the deliverables of what we achieved over the last year, the first group. And then Hallie Burns, who is remote, my also fellow co-chair, is going to tell you about the proposed follow-on group. We have one of the exciting things we'll be doing in phase 2 is interacting with the GORC working group on synergies and complementarities and working together between GORC and Meldreth. And CJ is going to give us a short presentation about that. And then we have 30 minutes at the end, which is very much an interactive session with people who are attending, who have questions, and also hopefully will develop some interest and people will get involved. I think we had over 100 people involved last year in the first working group over the course of the year, so hopefully we'll have equally good participation this time. So the group is kind of an unusual group, an interesting one. It's called the OFR. OFR stands for Oracle for Research, the OFR RDA group on mapping the landscapes of digital research tools. So if those of you who remember, Oracle has actually had a sponsorship relationship with RDA, and they sponsored in particular a couple of working groups, and this was one of them. So it was somewhat unusual in the sense that it wasn't a group of people coming together and saying, let's start a working group. The topic of the working group was proposed, and then those of us put in applications to become co-chairs, and Adam and I were among the lucky, or unlucky as it may be, ones who were selected. So that had an impact because it took us a bit of time to gel as co-chairs and as a group, but gel we did. And it also wasn't clear exactly, there wasn't really a roadmap for what we were going to do, again, somewhat unusually. So it took us a couple of months to get started, and eventually a plan emerged, and the plan was actually pretty much exactly what you're going to hear about today. And there were 3 stages in the process. The first stage was to come up with a harmonized model of the research data life cycles, and again, Adam is going to go through this in more detail. So we looked at various research data life cycle models and then came up with a harmonized model that we thought was kind of embodied the elements of some of the most relevant ones. And that was really just the first stage, and in a way that was the easy part. Then the second stage, what we did was we took the various phases of the research data life cycle, and again, this is very much a community process, so the process was that we had lots of people who were engaged, and we had various sessions and groups and task forces, and came up with, for each of the stages of the life cycle, 3 research tools which were representatively used during that stage. So you have this concept of the 10 or so stages, then about 30 representative categories of tools. That was stage 2. And then stage 3 was to come up with, for each of the categories, 3 tools which are representative of that category. So you're going 10, 30, 90. So it's actually quite a lot of information. And then we were more than fortunate, I think it was highly unusual, but because Adam is a multi-skilled person, he then developed an interactive tool which was able to visualize, and you can interact with it, and you'll see that today, to actually represent this map that we have come up with. So the process evolved, and it was interesting, and it was a kind of a typical mixture perhaps between the co-chairs doing the bulk of the work and then getting this community engagement in at various stages, which we really needed because we had, of course, each person has very limited information about any particular aspect of the research life cycle, so that was fantastic. And people like James and Andrea, and maybe some others I don't know, but who are here today were instrumental in in working on this process as well, so they're familiar with it. And then at the end, we kind of took a deep dive, and the co-chairs and I should also mention Rich Pitts from Oracle was a fantastic participant in this process. And you might think, well, one might think, well, maybe Oracle was trying to get something out of this for themselves, but absolutely not. Rich was an enthusiastic and a really important contributor, and also very knowledgeable. He was great. And also to mention Connie Clare, who was our facilitator, was astonishingly, again, as a facilitator, she was great, but she's also very knowledgeable, so she also had a lot of substantive contributions. So we were really fortunate with the resources that we were able to call on. And we kind of evolved the process as we went along. And then, as I said, in the end, and maybe this is typical, and CJ has a lot of experience with this, I know, in the end, it's kind of down to one or two people to actually really kind of put things together, and Adam's going to talk with you about that. So one of the things which emerged fairly early on and became really a deepening theme as the year went on was the synergies with what we were doing, the synergies, the complementarities, the potential for collaboration between the Meldreth model and especially the tools and services element of the GORC. And I think probably most people are familiar with the GORC. There's already been a lot of sessions about the GORC at this plenary as well as others. So again, Adam's going to talk a little bit more about some of our thoughts on working together with the GORC as we both move into the follow-on working groups. And then finally, I'm a marketing guy, so I have to say a little bit about marketing, and I think that's pretty important. So one of the things which I've been doing in particular the last few months is kind of marketing, socializing, putting this model out in the wild at conferences and presentations. And I must say the response has been fantastic. People it resonates, people are interested. And so that's good. And one of the key lessons, I think, for me anyway, takeaway, is that in order to do effective marketing, you need visual aids. So you'll see some of the graphics that we've come up with, as well as the tool. And you need things like that for people to really grasp it. So I think it was lucky that we came up with some of those, and we can do more work on that in the future. And I'll just mention that we've had fantastic adoption already, even though the model isn't really hasn't been completely approved by the RDA. So, excuse me, James at UCL kindly put in an adoption story from UCL. Adam may want to talk about this. JISC is adopting the model. We discovered, to our surprise, or maybe this isn't that untypical, that Oxford University commissioned an external review of their research data management, and they actually asked the reviewing consultant to use Meldreth as kind of the benchmark for what they were doing. So this is fantastic, so early on in our process. So welcome again, thank you, and with that I'm going to hand over to Adam.
Thanks, Rory. I'll back away from the mic a little as I tend to project. Okay, so what I'm going to do is discuss the kind of past, where we've got to, the kind of processes and practice, and the outputs that we've produced. So we had 3 work packages, as Rory has so kind of introduced already. We worked on the creation of a model for the research data lifecycle, which you will see in some of the slides called RDL. So the research data lifecycle. Then after that, we looked at how we can map tools and infrastructure to that RDL. And then in the final, we created some conceptual and prototype instruments that demonstrated the usability of this. And I'm very much going to say that because it was me rather than the team developing all the coding and stuff. And so I had some really great input and feedback on ways to do stuff. But one of the things that we need to talk about in the future is how we better resource the actual development of that. So the first thing was thinking about if we're looking at mapping instruments and tools to the research data lifecycle, what research data lifecycle? Where? How? And I'll do this, and then I'll come back to this one. So this is kind of like the process diagram of what happened. And in the first couple of meetings that we had as an actual working group, we were going to, well, when we say research data lifecycle, what do we mean? And we had 26 examples of what we meant. And obviously, we didn't want to create a mapping to 26 research data lifecycles. It would have been a difficult and kind of like really resource-intensive way to approach this. So we did a qualitative analysis of those 26. We then identified 5 prime candidates which satisfied a number of the criteria. And from them, we then created a harmonized research data lifecycle which had the characteristics that were either held in common or semantically mapped to various parts of this. So this here, which, oh, there you go, that worked, there we go. So this here is the Maldorf research data lifecycle, and it's a cycle, so it doesn't have a start. But you'll see at the top there is fund, which is a little bit sitting outside the cycle. So we found one of the things that there really wasn't a good kind of like consistency around was how funding was managed. But where it was in a life cycle, it wasn't necessarily always a complete part of the actual life cycle. It was a thing that kind of sat around the outside. So we have, from the first version where it was conceptualized, fund, planning, and they were kind of like all in the cycle, we looked to move that to a kind of a thing that sits adjacent to the cycle, but doesn't necessarily be a part of it. Similarly, I'll just read all these things out for you. We went planning, collect, process, analyze, store, publish, preserve, share, access, transform, and then conceptualize, which is both the beginning and end of the research data lifecycle. What are we doing next, or how are we going to start this in the first place? And again, this has a mapping to each of the 5 life cycles that we used, and the diagrams for that in the deliverables, which I'll talk about at the end. So the harmonization was allowed us to produce this one set of stages for the research data lifecycle, the RDA. Now, again, I'd really want to thank and acknowledge all of the members of the working group who helped to contribute to this. We spent some really intense sessions identifying the research data lifecycles, looking at the characteristics of them, and then proposing like the best 1 or 2, having meetings about whether or not we should choose one of these 5 because they're already useful, or whether or not we needed to create this harmonized version. So all of those discussions are, rather than just co-chairs, they're part of a group collection of expertise and experience. So I'm really glad that we have both a single thing that we can use in the rest of this process, but also we have the backing of the expertise with the criteria, the analysis that produced it. The next thing to do was, on each of those stages in the research data lifecycle, figure out what kind of instrumentation and analytical tools, platforms, software would be linked to those particular stages. So you'll see here we've got the RDL, see, told you, stage. Then we've got the number of tools that we identified for each of those stages. And you'll see, you know, quite tricky to figure out a thing that is actually an access tool, something that's in that access stage and kind of sits there. And you'll not be surprised that collect and process has a huge amount of tools. And again, store. You know, so those are the kind of like more instrumented, more common stages of the research data lifecycle as far as we could determine from, again, the work that we did was from a great set of people bringing their expertise and experience into this. And you'll see, okay, that's good. So I can see my face over this diagram, so I'm just going to move that out of the way. There we go. You'll see that for each stage, we then created 3 sub-stages or tool categories. And for each of those, we then created a set of 3 examples. So again, what we were trying to do is to ensure that when we moved this work forwards, there were clear ways that people could look at the stages, the tool categories or sub-stages, depending on how you want to call it, and understand what they were, understand kind of conceptually how they were kind of formed, and they related to their own work. Now, the stages all have definitions that, again, were synthesized from the parent research data lifecycles. So each of those stages has a definition that is in our deliverable 1. So if you're interested in what, as far as Mulders goes, each of those stages relates to, I highly recommend going to the deliverables. Okay, I'm going to do the nice, static, well-prepared part of the presentation next, and then I'll see if anything actually works when I try to do it live. So, I've been pointing there we go. So we created a prototype interactive tool, and this is done in R and Shiny. There's a lovely QR there, and if you snap that QR, it'll take you to Shiny hosting, and you can play around with it. So this was the first thing that was developed as a kind of way to talk about the conceptual use of linking the tools to the research data lifecycle. And you'll find, again, this is why it's really, really conceptual. If you click on each of these different kind of navigations, you'll get a static, which is this view of it, a dynamic, which is an expanded view of one thing, a schema view, and a text view. Now, all of these are driven from the information that we collected. So there's at the back of it an SQL-like database, because I was prototyping, that was easy. And if you click on any of those things, you can see, especially in the schema and the text views, ways to alter the kind of facets and presentations and so on. It is interactive, but it is not editable or updatable. So these ones are just a way to think about conceptually how we would do it. The next two, which I don't have screenshots for, but I'm hoping that I can demonstrate them shortly. And there are links in the interactive document that I know CJ's already put in the chat in the Zoom. So these things are two separate Python and various different things programs, again, backed onto the SQLite database. There's Maldrith Viz, which is interactive, and I'm hoping to demonstrate shortly. And that has the life cycle itself. Then it has each of the stages as a focus. There's 4 panes. If you click on one of the stages and then one of the sub-stages, that shifts, pardon me, that shifts to a different pane. And then from that, there's the tools. And all of those tools are interactive. So please be careful with my data. But it does generally refresh itself about once a month. And then there's Maldrith LF, which doesn't work very well, but it's again data-driven, and it allows you to kind of see those stages of the research data lifecycle, the sub-stages or tool categories, and then the various kind of exemplars. So what I will do in but a second is I'll hit escape here. We are being recorded, okay. There. Bum, bum, bum. There we go, that one. Right, so this is the medium strength prototype. So this is all driven from SQLite. You will see we've got the full life cycle, and again, it's a lovely interactive pane because by default you can't really see those things. So that's the life cycle, and ooh, there's an interesting stage, that process stage. Let's have a look at that. So if you go to then the stage selection, and again we've got a list of all the different stages here, you will see the sub-stages. So for preserve, there's a data repository and archive and containers. And again, I am still working on visualization, not my strong point. But each of these sub-stages then have information on these exemplars, archives, or sub-stages. And then each of these tools, let's just try process. Beg your pardon. Each of these tools then, these are all interactive as well. So this is the bit where I wonder whether or not when I was doing the last demonstration, I helpfully sort things out. Oh, there you go. So each of these, like, use that one instead, Adam. So each of these are now all interactive as well. So by clicking on any of those pieces of tool and information, you can update the information for the tool. And similarly, there are some affordances built in which aren't working very well at the moment to allow you to also look at the data, research data lifecycle in a little bit more detail as well. So you can see the idea here is that one of the outputs that we've created is something which is an actual interactive, updatable version of the software platform registry that we had that links back to a visualization of the Muldroth cycle, that links to visualization which doesn't work properly, of the substages, has your substage information, and then from that has the tools associated with it, which you can then actually curate. Okay, so one of the things that we were considering as we were like going through this rather intense, shortened 12-month working group, and I don't know how many of you are aware, they're kind of quite often 18 or 24 months. So in this kind of short pitch, we were thinking about both kind of what we were going to do next, but also how others might benefit from the process that we'd gone through, how to capture the practice. So as well as these three deliverables, and I'll just pop back to this one. You see that, right? I'm going to try putting it into full screen, and we'll see what happens. Perfect. Right, so as well as these three outputs which are currently in review, we have also the recommendation package. So our recommendation package talks both around the kind of like things that we have done and how that kind of practice and process would benefit other RDA working groups, interest groups. And CJ, you've got some of that in the GORC narrative as well, right? You've got this kind of great set of resources on the process and approach. And I think that's one of the things that we can really like contribute back as we do work inside RDA, is to make sure that we're capturing those kind of good practice and, well, we've got the appropriate criteria, best practices for the kind of way that we work and to make the best use of how RDA is structured. So just then, if you go to the outputs page in RDA, you can see our three output documents on the creation of that Muldroth research data lifecycle, and inside that there are also crosswalks and diagrams to those existing 5 models. The identification, second deliverable of categorizing and mapping of those different types of research tools. And finally, I did an overblown write-up for deliverable 3 on kind of like how that structural framework, how that kind of map of the landscape is created and how it kind of helps with the approaches towards more sustainable outputs from RDA and the recommendation package. So now we're going to have Hallie talk about Muldroth 2. Hallie, are you there?
I am indeed.
Fabulous. If you just say next slide, please, and I'll advance the slides here.
Sounds good. Thank you. I'm Hallie. I'm excited to be joining Muldroth 2 for the second follow-on group. I'm very excited to get started. So next slide, please, Adam. We have a couple of deliverables that we've outlined, particularly to continue Muldroth development, as well as other projects that were outlined in the deliverables for part 1. For the continued development specifically of Muldroth as a schema, there's the continued adoption as well as outreach and training that we hope to do as others become more familiar with Muldroth as a whole. We also intend to contribute to an attributes checklist and to investigate the integration into even more RDM platforms moving forward. And part of this is a constant filter of getting user experience improvements and soliciting feedback as we talk to more and more people become involved in the part of the process that is Muldroth. Next slide, please. The second deliverable that we're aiming to work through is focused on sustainability. We have a tool, we have a database. However, as we all know, research data management tools, software, they move at a very brisk pace. So this means that there's new developments happening constantly. So we need to stay on top of what that workflow might look like. How do we update the tools database? How do we make sure that these tools and systems, they're all working together and working properly? So the second deliverable will really be investigating this interoperability framework and making sure that the storage environments and the data itself is maintainable for preservation purposes. So our second deliverable will be focused on that. And then next slide, please. Our third deliverable is a collaboration with the GORC working group. CJ will be speaking about this more in depth in a moment. But in particular, we'll be looking to combine the Maldrith model with the tools element of the GORC model. We are also excited to take a look at the Maldrith model in relation to the GORC Health Data Commons profile. And within the past few months, preliminary discussions and mappings are already underway. So we're very excited to continue this work as part of Maldrith 2. Next slide, please. And then finally, this deliverable is potentially a little less research intensive than the others, but because there's a lot of information in many different places, we really want to create an output summary documentation. This will be a short document effectively outlining what Maldrith 1 has done, what Maldrith 2 will have done, summarizing the work to date, as well as the locations of materials, effectively a cheat sheet to make sure that all of the information is discoverable. Next slide, please. So looking ahead, we would love, love, love if attendees and those who are interested join us for Maldrith 2. If you want to be involved in working towards any of these deliverables, that would be great. Just to give an idea as far as where we're currently situated, the case statement proposal is currently underway. We've been working hard on that. Maldrith 2 also currently has RDA Tiger support, and we're excited to be working with our colleagues in RDA moving forward. As Adam and Rory said, we are working on an 18-month working group timeline. We anticipate monthly meetings, which will include a grouping of working meetings as well as planning meetings. We're also intending to have breakout groups focused on specific tasks or deliverables. In addition, we're looking to have separate meetings or sessions specifically with GORC in a way of collaborating. And as members of this group, we really want to offer the opportunity to really shape the outcome and deliverables that we're aiming to provide at the end of this time period. So with that, next slide, I will be handing it over to CJ.
All right, thanks, folks. So speaking more towards the GORC and Maldrith interactions, where we've started some discussions on this already, and where this idea of these models or these groups working together came from was actually from Rory. Rory was a very active member of and still is, a very active member of the GORC working group. And then when Maldrith 1 started, and Rory's a co-chair, it became very obvious through Rory's discussions that the two groups should be working together. There was not necessarily overlap, but complementary work. So what we've done to investigate this further was addressing the first concern of, is it a Maldrith versus GORC question, or is it a Maldrith and GORC question? And I think through a lot of conversations that we've had between the co-chairs of our two groups, and then some preliminary exercises we've done, especially on trying to map the two models together, it's been determined that it's a Maldrith and GORC. They don't supersede each other. They address different avenues. They have different scope. They are intended for different audiences. And ultimately, what we need to do is point to each other and figure out how does that pointing work. So it was attempted to do a mapping. I did a high-level mapping, especially to the services and tool element of the GORC model, which was great at a high level, but then realizing that there's a lot more information in that Maldrith model that doesn't quite fit within our GORC structure. And before I get even further perhaps into how these two work together, I'm going to take a step back, appreciating that not everyone has been at every group, every meeting. GORC has been talked about a lot. We have had a lot of sessions, but very quickly, GORC stands for the Global Open Research Commons Model. The model we're talking about is the International Commons Model, which is intended to be a set of considerations that a research infrastructure or commons would use to determine how they actually get towards this global interoperability phase. We'd like to see things connecting on a global level such that research objects and services are available to researchers anywhere when they need them with the appropriate policies in place. So in particular, one of the key elements or area of the model is services and tools, an obvious connection to Maldreth. So what we're thinking so far is we'd actually like to go back not to mapping, but figuring out how which pieces of which model point to the other. So if you're starting in the GORC model as a commons developer, as a funder or a policymaker, and you're working through all the various considerations in there, at some point, your technical teams are going to need to look at what exactly are you going to have in your services and tools. What exactly are you going to need to consider in there, and that's when Maldreth will likely come in. When that happens, how that happens, which pieces point to what, we need to figure that out. And vice versa, if you are looking at the researcher-centric Maldreth model, if you're someone who is looking at that model, there might be a point when you say, well, how does this interact with my governance or policies? And so what we want to do is have the models point to each other with more descriptive relationships. So our first step is going to be addressing why it's important for these models to work together, and ultimately why it's an and question, not an or question. Make that argument, put it in both of our case statements, because we are looking at having a second GORC working group, the International Implementations Working Group. I personally love that acronym then says GORC 2. Very pleased. So we're going to have that in our respective case statements to argue for a cross-group task force or task group where we can more fully work on those relationship building between items of the models so that they can work more easily and seamlessly together, because it really is complementary work that we're doing. I think that's where we are at this point, because part of that exercise is also going to be determining the next steps. This is the beginning, and we're really excited to work together towards interoperability ultimately. So I think from this, we'll pass it over to the discussion. Questions first, maybe? Questions first? Are questions not part of the discussion?
Wow. If anyone's got any questions about the work we present.
Yeah. You do.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, CJ. That was a very eloquent kind of overview of what we're thinking about. And as I say, I think this is a real opportunity. The GORC model is already, in the space of a very, very short time, captured the imagination of people in RDM and at all levels, from policy funders, and I think globally as well. And Maldreth is newer, but it's also rapidly gaining interest. And it's almost a no-brainer when you look at the two of them, that the and is there, that the synergies are there, and I think together they really have an opportunity to play a really useful role in helping to shape the future of RDM. Not to be immodest on anyone's behalf, but I think we all feel that. So we're really excited about this opportunity. So yes, before we move on to discussion, does anyone have any questions? James. Yeah, we need.
Hi, James Wilson, University College London. So it's great to see that people can now add new tools to the list, because obviously one of the potential perils of something like Maldreth is it can very quickly go stale as the situation changes. So it's really cool that you can add new tools. But obviously the more popular this gets, the more it catches on, the more you're going to have various companies just trying to add in their own tools and kind of spamming the system. Do you have a way to sort of moderate and exercise some kind of editorial control over what's being added?
Yes, I mean it's not for the moment it's read only, but the model is that it will be a moderated thing. It's not that anybody can just add a tool. That, as you say, then it quickly becomes meaningless. And the point is that if you look at the process that we used to figure out which tools, which categories and which tools might be represented, it was a community review. So there was input and people argued about it. And so it wasn't just, oh yes, let's do this, let's do that. So I think it's a good point. I think it's fair to say we haven't thought about exactly that. I think that's an aspect of sustainability that Hallie mentioned as well. So one of the aspects of sustainability is a moderation model. So yes, we are thinking that we'll have one, but we don't have one yet.
Cool.
Sorry, go ahead.
So the demo that's live currently, you can add checker, and it doesn't have, but it should have a curation element as well. So part of the system diagrams, if you look in the report itself, are around about the actual kind of flow of verified against submitted information. And as Rory said, that is something that will be part of the next set of work. But I thought it was important in the prototypes to show that element of sustainability, update, and curation.
There's a question from online. So Andrew, I see you have your hand raised. I think you should be able to unmute.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. The echo is going to be really annoying. I'll try and avoid it. First of all, thanks for the overview. And it's wonderful to see the progress that's been made by Maldreth. Picking up a little bit on the comment that James just made, I've been associated with a number of these mapping the landscape exercises over the last 20 years. And the issue for me, for those, has not been so much the creation of the model, it's been keeping the model up to date. I mean, I agree that the issue of having people spam it with tools is a concern. I guess I'm more worrying about keeping the database current. So my question is, if I'm a tool builder, what's the incentive for me to contribute to Maldreth and keep the information about my evolving tools current?
A lot of these kind of exercises, which they're one-off and then immediately they become stale and then they become irrelevant. And I think having the tools developers have this is a little bit different, I think. So, for example, if there are lists of tools like repositories, for example, and some of those allow the contributors of the tools to update the information about themselves. But that's not what I think. That's not what this is, because for each category of tool, we had 3 examples. In some cases, we were hard pressed to come up with 3. In other cases, we could have easily had 30 or 50. So this is not a listing. It's not intended to be a listing of all tools in that category. So it has a different function, I think. So again, open for discussion, and we'll work this out in the coming year. But it's not our intention that this be something that people can say, I want my tool to be there, it should be there, because it's not intended to be, it's explicitly not a comprehensive list. It's meant to be a representative list. It still needs to be updatable because things change constantly, and the categories also need to be updatable, and even the phases need to be updatable. Agreed. So so we will face challenges in that regard, but I don't think it's quite the same challenges as some of the other kind of tools listing platforms, at least that I'm familiar with. And Adam, do you want to say anything about that? Yeah.
So I think it's a really important and pertinent question, and I have 2 answers to it. One is, at its core, Maldreth, the research data lifecycle, is then being instantiated by the end of this working group with a set of stages, sub-stages, and exemplars. And that is the output. The sustainability and the way that that is both embodied in wider infrastructure and also the way that we collate and take submissions on the catalogue that we currently have are very much things that absolutely, because of the issues that both James and Andrew have raised, we need to make sure is something that is well discussed, well covered, and we have a good evidenced answer for our approach in the coming, I would guess, around about year, 2 years. So, yep, absolutely. But as Rory said, we are not fundamentally a tool catalogue. We are a research data lifecycle that maps with exemplars that we will have a consideration of exactly how much of that is involved in the various other things, as you saw from the outputs and kind of potential deliverables and the work plan for the next group. So we have to, I think part of the real answer to that question is we'd love to hear your opinions on that.
And will you make considerations about accessibility to any given tool, perhaps that might be geo-blocked or anything like that?
Thanks for asking. What do you think?
I think they certainly need to be flagged.
Okay.
Yeah, and they can be tested, but yeah. It just in the spirit of being open and everything for all to use, it'd be good to know as well.
Yeah. So a side anecdote that I guarantee will not take more than a couple of minutes. I used to work in the field of hypertext and hypertext performance, and the panel that I ran that people talked about for 4 or 5 years was accessibility in hypertext and performance. And so there are absolutely it's important that we make sure that we have an indicator, a flag, a field, a something which discusses those various characteristics. But again, we are not a catalogue. We are a model which contains those things. So I would see, again, some of the work that we've got in kind of like the really detailed and great descriptions in the Gork tool catalogue, some of those things, and also in, again, the instantiations and embodiment of Maldorf in the wider infrastructure would be where I would see those things being both kind of created and feeding into the kind of ecosystem. But yeah, no, accessibility is important, geo-blocks, all those things are important.
Are there any more questions online?
So, because we're here at RDA and because we are a working group, we figured that there might be a use for all of the brains that we have here and online. So what we were considering is that for those of you that are online, led by Hallie, we would talk about the kind of community needs, future directions, and that can then feed into the Google Doc. And there is a section in the Google Doc prepared for that. And here in the room, we can continue these discussions we have just started, which is why I was excited about these things, to think about these kind of like practical implementations of the model. Because again, these are things that will feed into how we consider the next stage. And for those of you who have machines open and have the interactive notes, Ryan, could you post the link again? That'd be great, thanks. What I was hoping to do over the next however long people are interested in talking about it here, discuss both kind of like the visualizations that you've seen and the way those kind of affordances link into each other, whether or not that's useful, whether or not we should go in a completely different direction. Continuing these discussions around about like the categorization, whether what we've done is kind of like useful enough, whether we need to, in the next phase, look at how that is developed, and then, of course, there's things about sustainability. And then what I'm hoping is that in the last little bit of that discussion, we can think about a couple of like kind of actual clear sentences that kind of summarize that. Does that make sense? Perfect. So thank you so much for your input already. Does anyone want to kick off on kind of thinking about how where we are now develops forwards? So this is not kind of a question on the things that we've done, but you know, with James, I'm sorry, you didn't introduce yourself.
My name's Venkat. I used to work at OpenAir and DCC.
Hi. So if anyone wants to just stick their hand up, and we'll have a quick kind of like 10, 15-minute discussion on this, or put things directly into that Google Doc under the thing, and I'll have a look through that, and Ryan's got all of our interactive stuff open as well. Otherwise, I'll talk for 15 minutes, which, you know, I'm perfectly happy and capable with, but I don't think everyone else wants that. CJ, maybe you need to start dancing. Okay, let me ask a more direct question. Who would have a suggestion for the next phase in the way that the platform that currently is based on Maldrith would evolve? So we have two kind of prototype things that are linked in the Google Doc. The Maldrith, which I call Maldrith Viz, which is the 4 stages thing, and then there is a sometimes working, sometimes not working Maldrith LF, which is about that kind of life cycle and stages thing. So what's the next thing that would be useful in whatever context you have? It's so good already, they don't need it.
Any comments, yeah. Well, so I always like to cause difficulties, so I'll try to cause difficulties for 2 of the attendees here, and apologies to Andrea and James. But since I know you were involved in, actively involved in the earlier group, maybe I could ask a slightly open-ended question and say, since you were part of this earlier process. Do you have any reflections on, but I don't think either of you was really actively involved in finalizing the outputs or deliverables. So in a way, you're seeing this for the first time, what actually came out of the work that we all did. Do you have any observations about the process and the work that was done, and any reflections on what you think would be good for us to concentrate on in Maldrith 2?
So we would want to have some either use cases or what's the term? It's a software development. User stories for how we want to use this. I can see as a librarian who's leading a team of new data librarians saying, here is a life cycle. Here are tools that may be of use during that life cycle to our researchers. So that would be one little story, user story. So definitely having an idea of what it's useful for, so that when people see it for the first time, they're not scratching their head. Starting with the user stories for people seeing it then for the first time.
If I'm allowed to comment on that, I guess I can do whatever I want, so I'll say that I think that's a fantastic suggestion. And I was just thinking, as you were saying that, you mentioned librarian, that's kind of a persona of someone who might be doing it. But another way of slicing and dicing it is, you could think of an organization doing that. Of course, an individual is acting on behalf of an organization, but as I said, we're in the fortunate position of having UCL, Oxford, and JISC, 3 organizations, who are already either actively thinking about, or in some cases have already used this model to do something at the organizational level, which is pretty similar to what you described, Andrea. So I think it's a great suggestion. Absolutely, I think we should do that. And when we do it, we might think about different personas or levels or angles of coming at it as part of that, getting different user stories from different kinds of perspectives. But great suggestion.
So I'm not sure if I have much more to offer in addition to that, because I do think the user stories are a great idea. In some ways, it's already had an impact on what we do, partly because we've actually it was the research data lifecycle model that we'd come up with actually fed into this, and it's already been improved by the sort of feedback. So we have a slightly more sophisticated lifecycle model now as a result of it, and we're already kind of thinking of the gaps in the tooling we have that can really help our researchers through that life cycle, and where those gaps are and what we need to do to plug it. So it's already having that kind of useful benefit. So, you know, we're certainly happy to help contribute to sort of a use case as to how we've been sort of thinking about it and using it as that kind of conceptual model at the institutional level. In terms of additional future directions, apart from what you've already listed, I'm not too sure. I mean, I think it is a great gap identifier. And I think people will, if it's not kind of updated in some way, and I take the point it is a conceptual model rather than a catalogue, then it will start to seem as though somehow it's out of date and it's no longer relevant to the world we live in. But I'm not too sure off the top of my head how else to apply it. I think the steps you've outlined sound good, but I'm perhaps not coming up with as many suggestions as you're hoping to get from me right now.
Okay, well, okay, thanks, James, and thanks, Andrea. And I mean, I think that getting user stories out there quickly is a really good suggestion, which will help us build interest as well. Adam, anything else you want to another question? Yeah. Or input, yeah.
Do I have to stand up? Can I sit down? Hi, Louise Besaden at Leiden University. I was actually also part of the Meldrith working group, and congratulations on the visualization, because I know it was quite a tricky process. I guess my question is more around the responsible representation of the tool now that it is ready to be released, and particularly thinking about the confusion that we had during the working group that is still also present in the discussion now about the fact that it is a research lifecycle model, not a catalogue of tools. And I feel that sometimes that is misunderstood. And what we are running the risk of doing by giving representative tools is creating a street lighting process where those tools are seen to be in some way endorsed over others. And to link into Venkat's comment about accessibility, that maybe there are some tools that are actually more suitable for the global research community, but they just, because in the working group we were listing tools that we were familiar with and that weren't particularly visualized. So I would definitely encourage critical reflection on that going forward, and how to avoid making it seem like those tools are endorsed, but also strongly encourage engaging with researchers from low resource settings to see what tools they're using in those stages of the life cycle, to make sure we have a much more representative group of tools that are being associated with the different stages.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of points in there. So the first one, which I think the message is coming through loud and clear, we need to be explicit upfront that it's not a catalog. So that's a really good point. And the various ways in which that can be done, but I certainly take that on board. As to the second one, again, as you said, it was a community process of selecting both the categories and then the tools themselves. So one way of one aspect of sustainability, but also relevance, is to I'm just brainstorming, but is to have regular reviews and have that be a community process as well. So that's one thing we probably should consider, but it's just an idea. But I take your point. It's a good point. We need to address it. How we address it for discussion, but that could be one way we're not, the issue will exist no matter what we do, but that's one way of at least admitting that it exists.
Yeah, it's a really helpful point, thank you.
Yeah, my suggestion initially before hearing that previous comment was about, I can think of various websites that focus, say, on like privacy-friendly tools and so on that have a very nice visual interface and they detail the specific category that a tool is for, and I think that could be a good kind of benchmarking we could do against that. But based on that previous comment, if the goal is not to help people find a tool to use, but more focus on the model, then there's different websites like kind of almost manifesto websites on, let's say, the brutalist web or semantic versioning that outline the models and provide examples, but the examples are not the longest list. It's more the descriptions of the specific things and a few examples. So I think there is that disbalance where when you see the visualization, the biggest amount of content is the long list of tools and all the things they provide. And so it feels like that's the end goal. If you're clicking through the things to get to the end point of having a long list, but is that the goal, or is the goal to kind of focus on the specific steps and understanding them? And so maybe that's something that could be reflected on.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. I mean, CJ, maybe I could ask you a question, because in the tools and services element of the GORC model, I actually can't even remember, but are there are categories, subcategories. Are there also examples of tools, just as a point of reference? I forget, or not.
That's a good question. So within the services and tools essential element, yes, there's large, like high-level categories and subcategories of tools, and they have attributes and features that are the characteristics describing them. Each item also has an extended description and examples. Okay. But the examples aren't the kind of examples that you have in Maldrith. They're more like the kind of tool that does plotting, but we don't actually list like matplotlib or anything like that in the example box. And something where Andrea was mentioning about user stories and then also highlighting personas, there is actually a draft profiling for academic librarians of the GORC model. It's very centric around Canadians because that's where I presented it, but I think that would be a cool thing to highlight as user stories for both, and that's an immediate one I see that would be helpful for librarians in particular, is the considerations that are for academic librarians from the GORC model and saying, okay, now you actually need to suggest something, or now you actually need to consider what the researcher needs, and then that goes directly to Maldrith. So we don't have that in the GORC. And that's exactly where I think Maldrith would be helpful, keeping in mind the other comments around it's not a full list of tools. They're examples, and then hopefully, especially through the interactive platform, Adam, that you're designing and have developed, and is some of them are working now, you might have additions from other members of the community too. So it might, maybe not like a full long list, but perhaps like a representative list for people to start from if they really have no idea where to look.
Thanks, CJ, yeah.
Does anyone else have a contribution? We have maybe 5 more minutes, and I've synthesized some recommendations. Does anyone have anything else that they would like to discuss?
Holly, I think you're asking a question in the chat, just unmute, I guess.
No, I'm just posing questions for the group in chat.
Okay, I'm going to make a few statements. Thank you very much for people who are going into this on going forward. And I'm just going to go back a few slides for a moment. Yeah, just on the looking ahead kind of thing. We have Tiger support for developing this. Ryan is there, and thanks very much for your help, Ryan. And Athena is our assigned Tiger support. And one of the things For those of you who are here, who are interested in maintaining contact, we really would ask you to both make sure that you're in the Google Doc for the list of attendees, or that you let us know afterwards that you're still interested, or join our existing working group. And one of the things we're going to try and do is move the membership of the existing working group into the new one as a first point of contact. Okay, so a number of different ways to ensure that you're kept updated and informed. Okay. Okay, so the kind of like outcomes we were hoping from these discussions are feedback, something from Hallie in a minute, some priorities for how we do that, and action items. Okay, so again, thank you for all the people who are adding to the notes. I have these 4 recommendations to go forward, and I'm going to read them all out, and then I'm just going to ask for a show of hands whether or not people think that they are kind of both reflective of what we've said and important for us to bring forward. And then we'll hear from Hallie. Hallie, about 3 minutes. So,
Thank you.
Cool. Recommendation 1, user stories are important. Personas and the kind of identification of how Maldrith and whatever the kind of thing is an important part of both the way that we discuss this now and the developments in the future. So that's the first one, around about user stories. Thank you. Second is we need to reflect and record existing use and impact. So James, you've already talked about UCL, using that to update the UCL. We've had the 2 concrete examples from UU and from elsewhere, right? And so it's important that we actually show and discuss those whenever we're going to. That's 2. And 3, we need to reflect on our exemplars, on both making sure that the process for choosing and identifying them and having them there is both open and available and obvious, but also we need to kind of review what our exemplars are and have a think about, that potential adjacency valorization, validation for those tools as part of that. And finally, we need to kind of like look for validation for our approaches on existing infrastructure. So whether things like model catalogs, whether things like platforms which have a model at its core, and then various other things that are similar, we should be, checking and keeping an eye on the way that that works. So those are the 4 things, and I'm just going to call them user stories, reflect, let's call the second one recording, the third one reflection, and the 4th one validation. So this is a bit where you can, honestly, it's just going to be raising your hand. It's fine, you can do it. I believe in all of you. So user stories, hands up if we think that that's kind of important and something we should be taking forward. That's pretty much everyone, thank you. Reflection on the kind of recording existing things that we have. UCL thinks it's really important. Yeah. Okay, but thank you. Reflection on the exemplars that we've chosen, and both the kind of like adjacency and what actually it means if something is picked as an exemplar and how we surface that. Second place at the minute. And then kind of like looking for validation and exemplars on other systems and tooling and making sure that we are doing like good practice. And okay, thank you very much. So in order, user stories, reflecting on exemplars, validation, and recording existing use are our priorities. Thank you. Hallie, would you be able to report on the discussions you've had online?
Yes. So in chat, we have asked 2 questions. The first is, just scrolling back up, that there's a number of different outputs that we're aiming to address as part of this follow-up group. Which direction do you think would be the most urgent for the community and stakeholders to be addressed first? And the second one, I've put both of these into the document as well. What are ways we can engage the community as potential working group members, as Maldrith adopters? moving forward. I would actually like to open that to the room as well, if that's all right.
Just state them really simply again, and we'll see if anyone has any thoughts or feedback.
Yep. So the first question is, there were a number of deliverables mentioned. Which deliverables do you believe is the most urgent for the community and stakeholders to have addressed first?
We'll go back
Let's
to the
begin with
slide for
that.
that. Hold on one second. Sorry. Okay, so of the continued Maldorf development, sustainability framework, collaboration with GORC, CJ, you can vote, and output summary, of those, where do people think the priorities were? Which of those deliverables do people most urgently want to read? I think we'll try that. Okay, in the room, you only get one vote. Okay, so it's 1, development, 2, sustainability, 3, collaboration, 4, output summary. So if the most important thing to you is 1, continued development, put your hand up. Yeah. Okay, that's fine. Sustainability framework. Collaboration with GORC. About the same as the second one. And our output summary, knowing where everything is and understanding how everything is. Okay, so people would like us to do continuing the development and then produce an output summary. And okay, thanks very much. Holly, is there anything else that either people have online to feed back into the room, or any other thoughts?
There's no other feedback from people online. There was a second question that was posed in as far as bringing it up. What are ways that we can engage the community as potential future working group members, as future Maldorf adopters? So echoing similar to items that you were discussing in the room.
Okay, great, thanks. Is there anything to report back from that, or?
Nothing to report.
Thank you. Okay then, I think at this point, the next thing is to say thank you. We really appreciate all of the work that's gone into our outputs. We really appreciate everyone that has been involved, and the people who've come here today to either learn and or continue to be involved. Rory or CJ, any last words? Okay, unless anyone wants to have just one final thing, bombshell. Okay, close the session now. Thank you all very much for your enthusiasm and participation. Thank you, bye.